Hello. It's December. How? I don't know. Welcome to November's reading wrap-up. November was an interesting month for me. I definitely went through a major reading slump in the middle of the month where I just wasn't reading anything. I was like halfway through a book and just not feeling like reading it. So I read a lot less than I read last month, but I still ended up reading 10 books, which is pretty good. But let's just get into it. So the first book I read is Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse, and this is the second book in the, I don't know what the name of the series is, but the first book is Black Sun, which I read in September. I didn't love Black Sun as much as I thought I would, but I did really enjoy it, and I wanted to read the next book. It left off on a cliffhanger, so this is the first book I read this month, and I liked it. It was another one where, oh, here she is. Hi, baby. Lead to the first book, I wasn't as drawn into it as I thought I would be. I feel like the thing about these books is that both of the first two feel very much like they're setting up for a big plot thing to happen, and then the plot thing sort of happens, but it doesn't feel like it lines up to what the buildup was. And I think really what these books are doing are building up to the third book, where from the setup in this book, some major things are going to happen, but it does feel like a lot of buildup for not a lot of plot happening. I kind of got to the middle of it and felt a little mini reading slump in there, because it just wasn't gripping me or transporting me or making me really want to continue reading at a really fast pace. I will say I liked the new characters that are introduced in this second installment. I like the continuation of character relationships, and especially the exploration of the relationships between characters that aren't necessarily allies or friends or that like each other very much. I'm really into political intrigue, and these books are very full of that. So if you're interested in political intrigue, if you're interested in really clever, interesting fantasy world that's well developed, I do think these books are worth reading, and I'm excited to see what happens in the third one. I do feel like, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Again, it's just been a lot of buildup, and I hope that the third one pays off. Next up, I read Family Meal by Brian Washington. Brian Washington wrote Memorial, which came out a few years ago, which I loved, and I just really like his characters and his plots. And so I was really excited to read this, and I liked this one even more than I liked Memorial. Camera fell down and now it's at a different angle. Also, I'm about to flash people. So, Family Meal follows Cam and TJ, who are two childhood best friends who lived in Houston. They're both queer, and it follows the events after Cam comes back to Houston in the wake of his partner Kai's death. He comes back totally messed up, grieving, really not in a good place, and returns to the fold of TJ's family bakery where he kind of grew up, and returns to that friendship and relationship with TJ and his family and friends. That is pretty fraught and complex. I really love how Brian Washington is just able to take really difficult things like grief and addiction and mourning and death and inequality and all of these horrible things and tell them in such a way that still manages to celebrate the human experience and celebrate life in general. And that's what this book does. Life and love, really. This is very much a found family book, which I love. And it's just very emblematic, I think, of the queer experience. It's very celebratory of the queer experience and of gay culture and of gay identities and the different ways that looks. It deals with a lot of really hard subjects like HIV and death and suicide and eating disorders and addiction and police violence, but it overall was a really uplifting book for me, and I found myself crying and laughing and just feeling so full at the end of reading it. So I would really recommend it. I thought it was beautiful. There's bits of Brian Washington's writing style that I don't love. I can't even really pinpoint what exactly it is. It's just that his writing style for me doesn't fully immerse me in the story, but I don't really find that matters very much because I do love the plots and the characters, and overall the writing is very poetic and beautiful, and again, celebratory despite the hard subject matter. So I cannot recommend Brian Washington as a writer more. I really encourage you to read Family Meal and to read Memorial. He also wrote a book of short stories called Lot, which I have not yet read, but I think all of his writing is really lovely. Next up, this is the only book off of my TBR that I made back in October that I read this month. Doing great on that, but it's the Doloriad, and I had started reading this way back in October when I was doing my reading vlog. Definitely got like 30 pages in and let it sit for several weeks before finally returning to it. This book is quite a difficult one for me to describe how I feel about it. It's another one where I feel like I didn't really enjoy the process of reading it. It's a very dense book. It's a very sort of convoluted book, both in the plot and in the writing itself, and in figuring out what's going on. It feels very sort of claustrophobic and strange, and there's very disturbing stuff that happens in this book. But I do think that, like, literarily speaking, having finished it and reflected back on it, it is quite a feat. This happens post-apocalypse. We don't really know what happens that causes the apocalypse, but we know it involved a lot of death and disease, and it wiped out not only humans, but a lot of other animals. This book takes place in the outskirts of Prague, and it concerns the matriarch and her brother, who, after the apocalypse happened, basically had this plan to repopulate the world in their image, which means that, yes, they have had many, many children together, and those children are having children too with each other. So it's extreme incest, and that is resulting in very strange mutations, really a lot of just disabled people. Matriarch and her partner, her brother, are almost safeguarding the knowledge of the past so as not to taint the children that have grown up in this apocalypse post-modern society. So the kids and most of the group don't know about things like genetics and don't understand that the way that they are breeding, essentially, is causing all of these really horrific things to happen to their kids and themselves. It's a very religiously coded book where one of the main characters is the only other person from before the apocalypse and is an old priest who is kind of the children's teacher. And again, he doesn't really teach anything that is relevant to what was happening immediately before the apocalypse. He does a lot of teaching of religious stories and myth and legend, and it's all very Christian and Catholicized, and the children and the descendants of the matriarch are living in kind of this, it's like their idea of what they're living in is very Edenic, even though they're living in something that is very far from what we would consider paradise. So the reason why it's called the Doloriad is because the matriarch has this like premonition that there are other people out there, and she sends her daughter Dolores, who does not have legs. She's mentally disabled. She's not even really able to talk. And she sends her out alone into the woods, basically as a marriage offering for these people that she thinks are out there. It's unclear whether she actually did that because she thinks people are coming, if she did it to get rid of Dolores, if she did it kind of as a threat to make sure the rest of the kids stayed in line because they might be sent away. But everyone assumes Dolores was sent to her death. And then she comes back. And she comes back without anyone else, but she finds her way back to the enclave, and that sort of throws the matriarch's power, all of the stories she tells, her grip on her children and their children's children into question. Again, it's a very loose plot. It's not plot driven. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. The writing is very dense and often shifts between characters' points of view, sentence to sentence or paragraph to paragraph. There's a lot of like paragraphs that are full pages, and it's written very stylistically, and I think it's written that way for a reason, because the style that it's written in is really creating the atmosphere of the book. And I think it does that really well. It is a very interesting piece of literature in the way that it was written. I think it was a little bit too stylistic. It's difficult to penetrate, and honestly, it wasn't until I was about 60 pages in that I felt like, oh, okay, I can like read this and understand what's going on even from like the very base level, let alone all of the sort of between the lines things that this author is trying to convey. I'm glad I read it. If you're interested in really how the style of prose can really create the vibe of the novel and almost the plot of the novel itself, this is probably one to pick up. Okay, next up we have Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. This is a memoir about the early days of Silicon Valley and the tech boom there, and how this woman, Anna Wiener, goes from working in publishing in New York to working in the midst of like this tech boom. A lot of it is about the culture of the tech industry, the misogyny, and just really discriminatory practices that were so common and still are, but especially in the early startup age. And it's also, in the last part of it, gets into sort of just like in the last part of it, it also gets more into how the consequences of the tech boom and the consequences and meaning of Silicon Valley in terms of capitalism and climate change and worldwide inequality and discrimination, and just how this culture and this tech boom has affected so much in our modern world. I found it really interesting, and I think she's a really good writer, and that it was a very propulsive memoir, even though there's a lot of it that like isn't the most exciting thing in the world. Like a lot of it is her talking about like getting up and going to work in the morning and like what work was like, which isn't the most interesting thing to read about. But the way she writes it is very narratively paced. It has a plot, and yeah, so I enjoyed it. I did feel at times as though her critiques of the tech industry, of the products and the culture and everything about it were not quite deep enough. Like she didn't really go deep enough, I don't think. She keeps talking about like capitalism and income inequality in it because it takes place in San Francisco, where the income inequality is one of the highest in the nation, and especially was when it was becoming the tech center of the US. And she doesn't really go into that in any meaningful way. I didn't feel she uses it a lot as sort of a talking point and then doesn't go any deeper into it. And there was a few things where that didn't happen in here, where I felt like it was, the ripe time to bring up some things that she just didn't bring up. I do think that she's a fairly privileged person from the outset. She was living and working in New York City for a publishing agency that was barely paying her anything, but she was managing to survive, and, clearly wasn't living like on the poverty line. But the way she talks sometimes is as though she was, and it just didn't sit totally right with me, because I think that she's a person who has benefited immensely from the tech industry, and still is, and yet is not really fully, she's not being an apologist for it, but she's not really fully analyzing its effects on both her and her place in the world, as well as like everyone else. So I don't know. I thought it was pretty good though, and it is interesting, and it is a fast-paced, like fascinating look at something I didn't know very much about. So that's Uncanny Valley. Okay, I don't know if you remember from last month when I read The Invisible Library and totally eviscerated it because I hated it. And then I was like, I'm not going to read any more of this because I didn't like it. Well, I read the second one this month, The Masked City by Genevieve Cogman. It is the second book in the Invisible Library series. And why did I pick it up? Well, at the very end of The Invisible Library, the copy I had, there was a sneak peek into the second book. And the sneak peek did its job and got me curious about the plot, because it starts with a kidnapping of one of the characters that I actually enjoyed in the first book. And I was in a little bit of a reading slump. I kind of wanted something that was just like not something I was going to think about very much and would be fast-paced and light. And so this was at my library on display, so I picked it up and I read it. And look, I still don't love Genevieve Cogman's writing style. I still think that the plotting of the books is a little manic in that it's like too much is being crammed into one thing. And it's like every fantasy slash sci-fi slash steampunk trope all at once. But I did like this one better than the last one. And I think part of that is that I do think that the plot itself was a little bit tighter. It was a little bit more well thought out. It felt more as though there was like a coherent plot line where everything that was happening was making sense in the context of that plot line. And it also did not take place in the sort of steampunk alternate London that I didn't like very much from the first book. This book is primarily about Irene, the librarian's assistant, Kai, being kidnapped by the Fae. And Kai just so happened, this is spoilers if you are thinking about reading these and haven't read the first one. Kai happens to be a dragon, which is sort of, we have the dragons on one side of the spectrum and the Fae on the other, and they are like two different ends of the universe, chaos and order, and are constantly sort of clashing with each other. So Kai, who is a pretty important dragon from an important dragon family, gets kidnapped by some Fae. Irene wants to save him, and so Irene and her fearless Sherlock Holmes character friend go to this different alternate world, which happens to be a very chaotic version of sort of Renaissance Venice, and go to rescue Kai. And it's a fun read. Again, I thought it was better than the first one. It did kind of make me want to read the next one. Again, I'm not sure I will, but I won't say for sure I won't since I ate my words last time. But yeah, I thought it was fun. I thought it was better than the first one. I liked the way that it continued to sort of build some of the relationships between some of the characters, as well as introducing some new ones. And I liked that it went a little bit more in depth into the lore of the world rather than just like throwing everything about the world straight at our faces without like any context or explanation. So I appreciated that about the book, and overall enjoyed it. So next up we've got Blackouts by Justin Torres, which just won the National Book Award. This book follows an unnamed young narrator as he travels out to the desert to visit with an older man who is dying, and this older man's name is Juan Gay. And he is in the possession of a set of volumes of a study of homosexual behavior from the mid-century that have been heavily redacted. And this is the life work of someone he knew named Jan Gay, who happens to be a real person. And this set of work also happens to be a real published study that happened. So this is a very interesting blend of fiction and nonfiction. The book is basically just a series of conversations between the narrator and Juan Gay about both the narrator's life and Juan Gay's life, and the life of Jan Gay and her partners and the various people who she interacts with, as well as the writers of this study, who essentially took the idea and the research of Jan Gay, who was a queer nudist lesbian, and yeah, stole it and then wrote her out of the narrative and the history. It was a really interesting look into, yeah, just the way that queer identities and homosexuality were viewed throughout pretty much the late 1800s through the modern day. The different ways that it was psychologically evaluated and considered, and the enduring erasure of identities and lives and people and love that has happened throughout history. I thought it was a really, really beautiful book. It's a very interesting exploration, and it's hard hitting on all of those points, but it's also a very delicate exploration of love and relationships, of familial ties or lack thereof, cross-generational queer connection and learning, sort of learning from the past. I think it also is very poignant in that it brings up how much of the queer, homosexual, gay population and all of the knowledge and stories and beauty and life that that group of people had that was completely lost to the AIDS epidemic, um, and how there really was just like a dearth of living queer people for a long time. And I think that's an interesting thing to look back on now, where I feel like a lot of people are like, well, where are all these queer and trans people coming from? It's such a fad. And it's like, no, they weren't around for the last 40 years because 90% of them died. So yeah, this book was it was really beautiful, and I want to read Justin Torres's other book. I have not read it. But yeah, I just was so drawn in with the style and the way he wrote it, and it was just a very unique book that I think it's gonna stick with me for a really long time. And it's interspersed with a lot of photographs and actual um, prints of pages from this study of homosexual behavior that had been redacted um, by Justin Torres in order to kind of illustrate the different points he's making throughout the narrative. The photographs are all of real people, or yeah, people who are playing into the story in some way or another. And there's a really interesting, his author's note and like bibliography at the end are also really interesting to read. So I just found this to be a fascinating read. I loved it. Again, I think it's going to stick with me for a while, and I strongly, strongly recommend reading it. Next up, I read This Country by Navid Matdavian. And this is a graphic novel about Navid and his partners move from the Bay Area to a tiny cabin in central Idaho a couple years before the COVID pandemic hit. And this book takes place in a town that is in the county where I currently live. Navid is Iranian, or of Iranian descent, and his wife and he both, his wife works in documentary filmmaking, and he is a comic artist. And they're both very, they came from the Bay Area. They're both very liberal. They haven't lived in the countryside or in really rural areas before, and so this book chronicles their building of a life here, and everything that it entails. I really loved this book, and I think part of the reason why I loved it so much was because of the fact that it's very applicable to my life. It is country I know, it is land that I love, it is communities that I am familiar with, and experiences that I have also experienced, some of them. I really enjoyed his art style and his illustrations as well. I think the style and the way that he compiles this book does an incredible job of bringing this landscape to life in a very realistic way. I think you can read it and you can really get an idea of this place without having ever actually come visited or been here. I also, yeah, thought it was a very poignant read because you can see the love of the place and the love of the land and even the love of the communities that Navid and his partner have, while also experiencing some of the worst parts of it, which, these communities are insular. They are very, very conservative for the most part. They're distrustful of outsiders. Like, there's a lot of places in the interior West these days that just fucking hate Californians and never shut up about how annoyed they are that Californians are coming and taking over and turning it into a liberal paradise. But yeah, they were two liberals from California who came to the middle of nowhere in central Idaho and moved in, and they experienced hate for that. He especially experienced discrimination on the basis of his race. And it's very interesting here where the kind of comments or discrimination you get for your identity it's like everyone is so neighborly and so open with each other in a very sort of surface level kind way, and yet will make these comments that make you know kind of that you are being judged or that you're not necessarily safe. This was also in the immediate, right before and immediately following the election of Trump. This book also talks about, it talks about politics, it talks about that insularity, and it also really, in a wonderful way, still portrays all of the characters, whether or not Navied personally had good experiences or bad experiences with them, as whole human beings, and with sympathy. And I think that's one of the things that I also have experienced a lot of living here and in other rural places in the West, is that the uh, the treatment of the folks who live in these places as dumb or as lesser or just as like write-offs that aren't important, or people who are stuck in the past or whatever, is not helpful, and also not true. The fact that he is able to portray all of these people he meets and interacts with as just like very full human beings is really impressive. And shows sort of kindness that he probably didn't have to show. And certainly not everyone or every experience that he had while he was living here was negative. There's a really beautiful friendship that they end up having with a local rancher who like cooks them Iranian food with like elk meat instead of lamb. And they have some neighbors who they help out each other throughout the winter. They reopen a movie theater in town, and that's kind of a trial and error type thing where it ultimately doesn't really work out. But there's a lot of stuff about like community and bringing community together in that. There's really interesting discussions of the environmental politics that are at play in this area. It was a very good like whole picture of an experience. All the negatives, all the positives, all the beauty, all of the pain, and I really liked it, and I think that the art is gorgeous, and the ending of it is quite moving and emotional and beautiful as well. So I've rambled about this enough. I really liked this book. I think you should read it. Next up, we have Lilith by Nikki Marmory, and Lilith is the retelling of the story of Lilith, who, biblically speaking, was Adam's first wife, who was cast out of the garden. This was a really interesting book. I obviously like the feminist retelling of myth and legend is a hot thing right now. There's a ton of books out there about it. I've read a lot of them. I've enjoyed a lot of them. I also feel like I've kind of come to the point where I'm getting a little bit tired of them, and especially getting tired of just like the overt, like, men are bad, which I feel like is really can sum up a lot of these books. And I don't disagree. Let's be put that out there. Like, men are very badly behaved in a lot of myth and legend, and women get the short end of the stick. But, sometimes I'm like, okay, a little more nuance would be nice. I really liked this book because I haven't seen a lot of retellings of biblical figures. There's a few more on the stage now, but this is one of the first ones I've read. And I didn't know very much about Lilith other than knowing that she is an entity and that she's usually like either the bride of Satan or a like demoness that seduces people, which honestly, she sounds like a lot of fun. I don't know. So this book really focuses on the myths and legends of Asherah. I think I'm saying that right. Who was Yahweh's consort, the Queen of Heaven. And this is a real goddess. This is a real deity that was worshipped in that region for a long, long time. And you see references to her as a deity through early Jewish and early Christian even writings, where she is considered, God's consort, but has basically been slowly written out of those myths as the idea of a one single god, a one single deity sort of took hold and then was established. I'm interested in early, like pre-Jewish, pre-Christian myths and religious systems. And so I knew about Asherah, I knew about other female deities that were originally sort of paired with Yahweh or whatever Yahweh's counterpart was. And I'm really interested in them. So this was a really fascinating read for me, and it definitely falls into the like men are bad genre, and where there wasn't as much nuance as I was wanting. But it also, I liked it because it was like there were some male characters in this who were unequivocally good and unequivocally like treated the women in the story well and were not sort of that super standardized stereotype that often shows up in these stories. So I appreciated that. This story follows Lilith after she is cast out of the Garden of Eden and becomes immortal. And she was given the gift of knowledge from Asherah. She believes that the tree of knowledge was gifted to her by Asherah, and that God, or Yahweh, was the one who did not want humans to have that knowledge and have that dignity. And so she embarks on a crusade that takes her from literally the time of the Garden of Eden all the way to the modern day, to basically bring that knowledge and the love of Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, God's counterpart, to humanity. And along that way, she encounters a lot of figures that, if you're part of Western society, you know about, like Noah, King David and King Solomon, and Jezebel, and Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, and on and on and on, throughout the years. And I found that really interesting. I think it was a well-written book. Again, I think that there were some things about it that it was like, okay, you could have used some more nuance here, or felt like a little bit of browbeating. But overall, I thought it was a really fascinating read, and I learned a lot from it. Also, wearing these pomegranate earrings, I just realized which pomegranates play a big role in that book. Next up, we've got Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks. This is a book about the plague, and it follows Anna, the protagonist, as she navigates a year of plague in the town of Eyam in England. It's based on a true story. So in 1665, plague was somehow brought from London into the town of Eyam and sickened quite a few people right away. And the town made a pretty extraordinary and unique decision to quarantine themselves, close the town's borders, allow no one in or out in order to try to contain the contagion and not spread it further. Very relevant to recent and current events. So yeah, this book follows Anna, who is a housemaid. She loses her husband. She loses the person who was maybe going to be her next husband. She loses both of her children. She loses everything throughout the course of this plague year, and yet experiences such an incredible amount of character growth and strength. And there's a line in here that I think is really good, where she refers to some people having been broken by the year of the plague and her being tempered by it. It's a very interesting story. I think Geraldine Brooks is a really good historical fiction writer. She reminds me of like Maggie O'Farrell in that she's able to really create such a vivid world of the past that we don't know. We can't barely even imagine what 1666 in England was like. But she creates this world that is just so believable, and it feels like you're there. It feels like you're experiencing it. It feels like all of the people and characters are real. And that is so impressive to me when someone can do that with historical fiction, especially far back history. And she does it really well. This book is about female friendship. It's about female empowerment. There's a lot of discussion of religion and sort of Anglicanism versus Puritanism, and that clash of cultures and struggle, and also witchcraft, which is a big part of this book. And I found it really fascinating, and I thought it brought up a lot of really prescient questions about our world and how we dealt with a pandemic and dealt with this deadly disease compared to how they were dealing with it in the 1660s, when they had no idea about germ theory or how plague was carried or how people got sick and some people got better and how any of it worked. And it was all just acts of God. And so, yeah, I found this really interesting, and it's an older book. It's from 2001. It feels so relevant. and I do really like Geraldine Brooks. Would recommend this. Okay, last but not least, the last book I read this month was Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe, and this is a nonfiction book about the Troubles in Ireland, specifically about the murder of Jean McConville, who was a single mother of 10 in Belfast, who was killed by the IRA for being an informant, but no one ever really was able to tell if she was an informant or not. And this takes that murder and basically tries to tell the entire story of the Troubles through the lens of that murder and all of the people who were involved with it. I thought it was so fascinating. I don't know very much about the Troubles in Ireland, aside from having watched Dairy Girls and my Irish family talking about it when I was a kid during Christmas. So this was a really interesting book to read. I learned a ton. I knew sort of the broad scope and outline of the conflict, who was involved, what was happening when, but I didn't know any of the details. I really didn't know how deeply tied the IRA is to the current the current political parties in Northern Ireland, nor how British influence and British rule has also, how much it still holds sway as well. And I didn't know a lot of the details, and I thought this was really fascinating. Patrick Radden Keefe is an incredible storyteller. He's an incredible nonfiction writer. I read this book. It's a chunky book. It's pretty hefty, and I read it in 2.5, 3 days, and it's just so invested in it and so interested in knowing what was happening. He writes it in a very plot-driven way, again, similar to kind of Uncanny Valley, where it's nonfiction, but it feels as though it is a plot-driven work. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything bad to say about this. I think it's a really fascinating book. I think it's a really well-written nonfiction book. I do think that it's focused very specifically on this murder, which was carried out by the IRA, and so it's very heavily focused on IRA activity, IRA members, IRA terrorism, and it doesn't fully kind of give the context of the whole thing, all of the violence that was happening, all of the paramilitary groups, all of what the British government and the British Army were doing, and what Protestant paramilitary groups were doing, which were, so, it puts a little bit more of a magnifying glass on the actions of the IRA without sort of the context of what else was going on. But I don't think that really detracts from what the book is saying, because again, it's focused on that murder and sort of telling the story of the Troubles through that murder. And there are definitely a lot of other books that you can read that talk a lot about all of the other stuff that was going on and a little bit more in depth into sort of the other paramilitary violence and government sanctioned violence that was happening. I found it really interesting, and I would strongly recommend reading it. I really want to read his other book, Empire of Pain, which is about whatever the family is that owns OxyContin and the opioid epidemic, because I've heard that's also incredibly well written. Very different topic. It's kind of funny how much he jumps around between topics and the books he writes, but yeah, fascinating book, really enjoyed it, would strongly recommend. I said that was going to be shorter, but I don't necessarily know that it was, because I rambled so much about books, so this is going to be a fun editing journey, but I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for joining me. Let me know what books you read this month that you liked, or hated, and why, and I will talk to you soon.